with the minutes and keeping them coming, and I do a very terrible job of remembering to bring them up because so I'm going to start with that today, and I will take a motion to approve the minutes, and I'll discard, and and second by Representative Hill. And I will start with the discussion with, on the 28th, there is a little duplication in one area, and Michelle will take that away. Do we have any other corrections, additions, or changes for the minutes? Seeing none, we'll vote to approve the minutes that we have published that extend out to Thursday, January 30th. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right. So we're going to do a couple of things today, but before we do, I'll just kind of review this week's schedule. Today, we're going to hear Senate Bill 50, and then your agenda says Dr. Harwood, and that's now Gabrielle Hull. He got called away for something else that was very time sensitive, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the service centers. And I thought it was important for us to have a better understanding of what the service centers do and don't do, because they've been mentioned in committee. And then tomorrow we will have a hearing on SB 45. And that is requiring the State Board of Education to calculate the graduation rates for all school districts for purposes of accrediting using alternative calculation. And you'll see that if you've not looked at the most recent weekly agenda, I did add an informational briefing from Dr. Harwood to kind of explain the background on how that is currently done and what federal requirements are. And I thought that would be very helpful before we heard SB 45. On Thursday, we will work SB 50, and it's possible I may add an informational briefing for something that I'm still trying to get figured out. Friday, I have down meeting call of the chair. I have been trying to avoid Fridays for you guys, and I think this Friday you're pretty safe to go and make plans. I know there's a lot of bills that we got over from the Senate. I'm still going through those and deciding which ones I want to hear and in which order, and then so I'll kind of give you some more information on that tomorrow, because I know you guys like to read ahead, which I appreciate about all of you very much. So we'll go ahead and open the hearing on SB 50, and we'll begin with our revisor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill 50 would make some amendments regarding uniform repayment terms and conditions for service scholarships that are administered by the Kansas Board of Regents. For those of you who have been on this committee, this was a bill that was introduced last biennium and heard in this committee. It creates 3 new statutes that establish a uniform repayment terms that would establish these are for scholarships in which there's a service requirement, and if the recipient does not complete the service requirement, then there is a repayment obligation of the financial aid that they were given under the agreement that they signed with the Board of Regents. And so those repayment terms, if they fail to meet their service obligations, are the conditions that are being addressed in Senate Bill 50. The first of that is establishing a uniform interest rate of 5% per annum on the obligation, and establishing an accrual date on which the obligation to repay begins. That is to be determined by the board. The provisions apply to all repayment obligations, including those arising from financial assistance that was provided prior to July 1st of 2025. And then it also specifies that if there is a slight discrepancy in the interest rate that was in place when the agreement was entered into versus the 5%, then the lower of the interest rates will apply. The bill also introduces some new statutes to give the board some authority to recover reasonable costs for collections on repayment obligations, including attorney fees, court costs, and collection agency fees, and to give the board some authorization to set charges and fees for the cost of administering these service scholarships. That's new language on page 2 of the bill. The remainder of the bill is amending the specific service scholarship statutes throughout Chapter 74. In the memo, I've listed out the different service scholarship amounts. Not all of these programs are active right now due to, I believe, funding issues. But the amendments for each of these would be amended to bring them into compliance with the uniform interest and accrual date provisions under Section 1 of the bill. In addition to those changes, under the Adult Learner Grant Program, there's a further amendment in the bill back in, I think it's Section 15 of the bill, the last section, that changes so that the student is entering an agreement with the State Board of Regents rather than with the specific post-secondary educational institution, and that's just more of a housekeeping amendment to that scholarship program. These changes would go into effect on July 1st of this year. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Questions for our revisor? Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if right now, if they're paying 6.5% or so, that, this is just going forward, right? It's not going to go back and change anything if they're already paying on those? That may be something for Elaine.
I think, looking forward, that's what I thought it was. Yeah, it was looking forward. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, it's been a minute since I thought about this bill.
Representative Pishney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, excuse me, this wasn't my question, but I thought in the memo that we had provisions will apply to all repayment obligations, including those arising from financial assistance that was provided prior to July 1 of 25. So
Let me explain that a little bit better than I did.
so yeah, maybe I'm.
So the uniform interest rate applies when the obligation begins. And so you may have received assistance prior to July 1st, 2025, but you're still in school or you've met your service scholarship up to that point. But if you fail to meet your service requirement, and so your obligation repayment then kicks in, say in January of 26, the uniform interest rate and the accrual date would kick in at that point.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And Madam Chair, then my question is this, just for me to get a better context of this whole thing, who brought the bill and why did they bring the bill?
I think the proponents can answer that.
Okay, I didn't know if that was something you could answer or not. All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Any other questions for our revisor? All right, seeing none, Jason, thank you very much. And we will begin with Elaine. How are you today?
Very good. Happy to have some sunshine and warmer weather. Much better than last Tuesday. Thank you so much for letting me be here before you today, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. I am Elaine Frisbee. I'm Vice President for Finance and Administration with the Board of Regents. And Senate Bill 50 was introduced at the request of the Kansas Board of Regents. We requested this bill last year as well, and this committee passed out favorably House Bill 2644, which is essentially the same concept. We have 22 state financial aid programs that we administer on behalf of the legislature. Each one of the statutes, those programs was established in law over many different timeframes, and so each one has its own unique little way of explaining when someone goes into repayment, why someone gets triggered into repayment, the repayment terms and the interest rate. So this is our attempt at unifying all of those into a standard interest rate at 5% rather than the federal plus rate. And attached to my testimony, we did provide some information on what are those interest rates. And we are currently in excess for many of our programs over 14%. I do want to clarify for the nursing service scholarship, this change was adopted in another bill last year that was amending this nursing service scholarship. So that has been done, but we want to make all of our programs uniform in that way so that it's a little bit easier for us to explain to students. And then students also, that we still want some incentive for the student to fulfill their service obligation. That is the point of these programs. So we have a nursing student go through school, become an RN or some other BSN, and then do time working in Kansas in the healthcare industry. That's the whole point of the program. So while we want to have that incentive there for them to fulfill our service obligation, we also recognize there are things that happen in lives. We have some instances where, for whatever reason, a student cannot fulfill their obligation. And they may not have an opportunity to easily find an employer who can help them make that payment. For some occupations, they can. Physicians, you'll see that oftentimes where an employer will offer an incentive for a physician. We'll pay off your loans for you if you come work for us for so many years. That it may not necessarily be the case for a teacher or a nurse. So for our programs, our proposal is to unify to a flat 5% rate. And also, one important nuance, when you go into repayment, when you are found to be you are not fulfilling your service obligation, in some cases, the interest rate gets applied all the way back to when you first received a grant. And that can be a number of years prior. And so then you get into some large repayment balances, and that's also something we want to clarify. The interest starts to kick in when you are first found to be out of service. So I hope that's clear. The adult learner amendment that Revisor Long mentioned is a technical issue created a couple years ago when the Adult Learner Grant Act. The language that was placed in the statute mimicked some other language that we had later changed to the Promise Act, so that our agency is the one responsible for service agreements with the students, not the institutions. So it's our agency that has responsibility for tracking all of the students and the graduates through their service. So I hope that helps. Be happy to stand for questions.
Questions? Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My husband was a recipient of the Rural Health Scholarship, and one of the great motivators for him to keep up his obligation to serve in a rural community was that interest back to day one that was quite hefty. Do you think this is going to affect or reduce the number of people who will follow through with the service scholarships, or do you think it'll be a wash?
Madam Chair, if I may, Representative, I'm not sure that it would have a measurable impact. It would be hard to predict. For many of the folks in our service programs, the Promise Scholarship comes to mind. This is where we have the bulk of our students who are currently in repayment. Their amounts are much smaller, especially compared to a physician's, but I think that the goal here was to give enough of an incentive for students to meet their service obligation without burdening them with undue amounts owed for the rest of their life that they've got to repay. So we have worked really hard at the Board of Regents in increasing student financial aid, and you have blessed us with a lot of financial aid funding for our students, and we are now seeing the impact to that on our student debt levels, which we can happily provide to the committee if you have interest. We're very pleased to see the debt of our program graduates diminishing, and we are nowhere near the national averages, but would like to think that there's a balance there, that the 5% is enough to get them to do their service, but not so burdensome that it just encumbers them terribly.
Thank you. We'll go to Representative Hill, Pishney, Wolf, and then Brantley. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Frisbee. I'm trying to get my head around this a little bit. So you're saying currently the interest rates for repayment are how much again?
For many of our programs, if I may, Madam Chair, it's the federal plus rate and 5 percentage points, so which varies year to year. So right now for this fiscal year, it is 14.08%.
Okay. So the purpose of this bill is not as much standardization as it is reducing the burden on students that default? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Madam Chair, it would be both. So unifying everyone to 5% going forward, so I think Revisor Long explained that distinction. This is a prospective change. So if you incur an obligation after July 1 of 2025, making everybody to the 5% rate, and then reducing. So folks who already have a burden in repaying to us, that will not change. But going forward, those students then would not be encumbered with a 14% interest rate.
I'm having a hard time understanding in my head that when a student signs an agreement to repay if they default, that's what this is about, right? If they don't, is this a grant that they have to repay if they don't default, or is it just if they default?
Madam Chair, it is if they go into repayment. So you could consider this a forgivable loan, but we're very sensitive over calling it a loan. So this is a service scholarship. So in exchange for the grant, for you to pay tuition and fees, or for whatever purpose the grant is given to you, you agree then to typically live and work in Kansas for a set amount of time in exchange.
And the idea, I remember that particular one, the idea is to get people living in Kansas, and I don't understand why that's in the best interest of the state to offer forgiveness for a portion of the interest rate if they default.
Madam Chair, we aren't forgiving any portion of the interest, so they would still owe some amount. We're just suggesting that perhaps the amount shouldn't be a 14% rate. The interest rate could potentially be 5%.
That sounds like a less rate. I guess maybe we don't call it forgiveness, but a lower rate.
And if I might also explain further, the amounts that a student repays, so for example, for our nursing service scholarship, a nurse goes through a program and then decides to leave for Utah. And they decide that they are going to go into repayment for whatever reason, or they decide they're just not able to work. The repayment funds then come to us, and we plow them back into the nursing service scholarship to make additional awards. But the interest that is earned, so for example, I asked our finance folks for some information on what do our students owe. We have 434 individuals in repayment status. 180 of those are from the Promise Scholarship. They owe $1.9, just under $2 million in principal, and they owe $1.1 million in interest as of the end of January. So we are trying to suggest that the interest rate, that 5%, we'd be best positioned that the interest rate should not be so extraordinarily high, that it should be something less. And we did some research for what do other states consider when they're doing this. Some are at 0, and some were at 5, and we felt like 5 was a balance between meeting the needs of the state and getting the service, but not encumbering the student with such heavy debt.
When they're taking the grant, we're going to call it a grant, we're not going to call it a loan, we're going to call it a grant. When they're taking that grant, has that been a hindrance to, I mean, I assume the terms of repayment upon default are included in that. Has that been a hindrance? Have students looked at it and said, well, that's just going to cost me too much if I decide to default on this, so I'm not going to take it? Has that happened?
Madam Chair, if I might, I do believe
You may, and then we'll let somebody else have a
Okay.
chance.
I do believe that we have students who, when they see the terms of the promissory note that they must sign, they do decline.
Okay,
Yes, that does
thank you.
happen.
Okay, Representative Pishney?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of things. First of all, it sounds to me like the 5% is an arbitrary number, that it's not based on any particular chart or anything like that. Am I correct on that understanding?
Arbitrary, I suppose. So it was a number that came out of when our former Director of Financial Aid surveyed other states to try and get a sense for, no one was above where we were. We felt like we didn't want to be quite so high and so punitive, if you will.
Well, I'm more comfortable with 8 or 9%, knowing what interest rates are on operating notes and so forth. But I'm not against getting away from the formula because I think that does raise the rates to an exorbitant level. My question then is this: on the nursing and the promise, I'm not understanding how those rates are so much different if we're working on the formula right now, because they're considerably less than the 14% that the others are. So can you just help me understand better why those two are so much different?
Yes. So each
You
one of
may,
the,
and then I'll have our reviser kind of tell you a little bit what was unique about both of those bills. I'll give him a chance to find that.
I do not have any follow-up questions after that, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
all right. So the promise and the Promise Act was originally passed in the 2021 session and has been amended about every year since then. And at the time when that statute was created, it was just set at the federal plus rate. The language about adding the 5 additional percentage points was not in that statute. Last year, when we first brought this bill up, the nursing service scholarship was amended, also at our request, to create more opportunities to get more nurses into that program. We had a sponsorship requirement, and now it's an option for students. And so we are seeing more take-up for that program with that change. And when the legislature made that change last year, they did take the interest rate to the 5% for us.
You're welcome. Jason, do you have any historical references to add?
No, Madam Chair, Ms. Frisbee was accurate in her statement on the Promise Scholarship when that was first enacted back in '21. And again, with the Nursing Service Scholarship, there were additional substantive amendments with regard to that scholarship last year that the legislature enacted along with the 5% interest rate change.
Thank you, Jason. We will go next to Representative Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So am I correct in understanding the 5% starts the day that they're in noncompliance, not from the day they take out the loan or grant? That's correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, does it ever sunset, the 5%, or do we just, 5% is what we're going to say, regardless of what interest rates do?
The way this bill is drafted, it would just be the 5%.
Okay, and then my other one was for something that someone else asked. How many students do we have that default at the current time?
Default, I'm not.
Or leave the program and, sorry.
So we have students in repayment. We have 434 currently in repayment across all of our service programs. We do have another group of folks who are in default. So we do have then instances where people stop making payments on their debt owed, and that's where we start a whole other process. That number, I'm afraid I don't know. We'll have to get that.
If you could send that to us, we'll make sure that becomes a part of the record. Representative Wolf, did you have a follow-up? Okay. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today, too. And this may be a partial reviser question. Our reviser mentioned that not all the programs are active right now due to funding issues. Can you tell me, are any of these not active right now?
Madam Chair, these are all active.
All active.
We do have funding. One particular feature of the budget process that we've had the last 2 legislative sessions, the 23 and the 24 legislatures were generous enough to give us almost like what I call a no-cost extension. The legislature appropriated us an additional year of financial aid funding. So just for our financial aid for students, the legislature appropriated an additional year out, much like you do for the biennial fee agencies and the State Department of Education's K-12 funding for schools. So it then allows us to notify schools, this is how much we know we're going to have, because when we make an award to a student, we like to make that as a commitment for the for that, as long as that student is enrolled. So that could be 2 years, it could be 4 years, depending on their program. And so it's very helpful for us, especially when schools want to make student awards even earlier than this time of year, but you haven't passed your budget yet. And so it's very helpful to us to have that additional year out for funding.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, can we clarify with the revisor if any of these, or maybe clarify what he was talking about on the not active funds?
Jason?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, it was my understanding that certain programs, specifically the Kansas Ethnic Minority Fellowship Program, was not being awarded at this time, but perhaps my understanding is incorrect. So I'll defer to the Board of Regents.
Thank you. So the Ethnic Minority Fellowship Program was a graduate level program we had many years ago and suspended 20 years ago, perhaps. I'd have to go back and look. So there is a remaining fund balance in a repayment fund just for that program. And in our budget process, we had requested that that money be moved actually over to the Educational Opportunity Scholarship so that we could then use those funds that are just sitting idle. We can't use them in that program where the money's sitting now, so we'd like to move them over so that we can make awards to students who are either first-generation students or dependents of teachers or those who work in the classroom.
I just might add a little bit of clarification. I think it's possible that committee members are looking at the chart in your testimony and thinking that's an exhaustive list. But I don't think it would be, because I notice I don't see on here emerge, and I don't remember what the percentage of that is, although emerge would be different because we do allow for somebody who's injured in the line of duty not to repay that if they're if the chief of staff of their branch or directing chief, the Army and the Air Force each use a different title, but they have a different way out of not paying it back if they're hurt in the line of duty. So this is not a exhaustive list, correct?
It is not, and if we had emerge or the National Guard Tuition Assistance Program listed here, those interest rates would actually be 0. So National Guard members, that's correct. I know for sure on the National Guard Tuition Assistance Program, if you don't fulfill your service in the Guard, you must repay, but I believe there is no interest rate for that one.
Thank you very much. Representative Brantley, did you get all your question? And
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you.
Representative Wolf?
Yes, let me clarify something. You said 434 were in repayment of how many? How many people? Have you said that before? How many are in this? Or approximately how many people we're looking at in this?
We'll have to go back and look. So I would need to check on the timeline for when, so those are over multiple years. In our programs, we serve several thousand folks every year, and especially with the Promise Act now.
And of these 434 in repayment, is it possible that a doctor or someone from another state has told them they'll repay their loans if they go there, and so they aren't necessarily repaying these themselves? Or a facility or somebody else could be paying for them?
Madam Chair, that is certainly an option, especially depending on their occupation and how much in demand they are. An employer certainly could be seeking to be offering that incentive for folks.
Thank you.
Osteopathics come to mind.
Representative Schmoy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, out of this table that we have in front of us today, there are 6 that will be reduced by roughly 9%. So aside from the student whose bottom line it affects and they're paying it back, whose bottom line does this affect? Like, who's losing money when we're reducing the interest rate?
It would, so, Madam Chair, the difference in repayment would depend on a student going into repayment. So if the student fulfills their service obligation, there is no net effect for those students, and that is the majority of our students. For those who do go into repayment, then who would not be receiving those funds, that would not go back into our service repayment fund to make
Okay.
more awards.
All right, thank you.
Representative Chauncey, I'm sorry, Representative Steele was next, and then Chauncey.
Ladies first. Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there a reason, I mean, we kind of went through this arbitrary thing, but what was the history behind the plus loan rate and adding the 5 points to that? Because to me, I think it would make sense if we just take the 5 points away there.
Madam Chair, I'm afraid all of these interest rates, but for the Promise Scholarship and the Adult Learner, those newer programs, not Adult Learner, but the newer ones precede me. Some of them, I think the osteopathic program might, that statute might be from the 1960s or 70s. So I'm not sure necessarily what the thinking was there. I suspect it was an incentive to try and make sure people do fulfill their obligation to make that so high. But then, of course, those rates have fluctuated quite dramatically, and I don't know what, we'd have to go back in time to see what that federal plus rate was back then, too.
And then to note the representative that just spoke, so you mentioned you had the fund, so what are you using those interest rates for? Like, are you paying something with that? Is it just sitting in account accruing interest for the state? Like, because that's going to get drastically cut.
Madam Chair, so the goal is that we never get another repayment dollar, right? So the goal is the student fulfills their service. So they're living and working in Kansas and paying income tax and buying things and owning a home and all the things, running a family. The goal then is that we would be running the programs, we would be making student awards with the state funding that we get from the legislature each year. And that's what we would be hoping to run the programs through, and that's through the whole budget process. The incremental variance between the 14% interest rate for those students who do go into repayment and the 5%, that would be a ding to our repayment fund, some small decrement. We could go back, I guess, and try and do an estimate as to what that fiscal effect would be.
Madam Chair, I would really like to know what that would be. I guess I'm just not understanding. If we're collecting this interest, what are we using that interest for? It should, I mean, is it just staying with KBOR? How much are you actually receiving in dollar amounts?
Yes, so for each of these programs, we have a separate repayment fund. So if someone in the nursing service scholarship, it comes back to the nursing service program. So we only use those dollars to make student awards through the program and not for anything else. And
So
yes, the interest earnings on any idle funds do go to the state general fund.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, very detailed questions. Representative Chauncey.
Yeah, just one quick question, I guess, to touch on a point you just had. So the whole objective of all these scholarships or grants, I guess, is to, excuse me, for retention of people in Kansas. Do you feel then by lowering this interest rate, it's going to encourage more people to just go into default and go to different places because there's not as much obligation to repay the note or stay to their commitment for their certain number of years?
It would be hard, Madam Chair, to predict how this will change human behavior. Now, we do know, I should also clarify, we have all the data on our program's graduates, where they do, if they are working in Kansas or Missouri, we know what earnings they're making after they graduate. So we can make that match of John graduated with this degree from this institution, and he got a job in Kansas, and he's earned this much money 6 months out from graduation, and year after year, we can see that progression. How this might incrementally affect our student graduates and discourage them from staying, I would like to think we're still being quite successful, especially with our community college and technical college graduates. We have very good data on all of that. So,
Just one more real quick. Just real quick on that, I mean, when you buy a house, if you're paying 14% interest, you're kind of look away from it, but if you're only gonna pay 5%, you're a little more inclined to go ahead and take the interest and buy the house as an example, I guess I was trying to say. So to me, I feel like it'd be more encouraging to sign the note, get the grant, get your education, and then repay it over time at a lower interest rate. Was the only question I really had about that. So I didn't know if there was anything was considered in that application, I guess.
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
The only other thing I would add, Madam Chair, is that we do have students who graduate and have every hope and intention and wish to fulfill their service obligation, but things do happen in their lives that do prevent that from happening. They could suddenly find themselves disabled and unable to work or whatever such things. We do have some liberty to grant exceptions, to write those things off, but to a large extent, we are limited in what we can do because we've got to fulfill the obligations of the statute. So this was trying to be a balance between meeting the needs of our students and meeting the needs of the program, the state.
I've got a question for you, and then Representative Brantley has another. How does the 5% interest rate compare to most student loan interest rates? And I don't know if that's something that you'd be prepared to answer or not, but I just kind of got curious.
Madam Chair, I would want to research that before I responded. I do believe it is lower, would be lower.
Which one would be lower?
5% would be.
5% would be lower than a student loan. Okay. Representative Brantley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again. So I feel like we have some really good data here, but I feel like we're right up to the point of seeing the results. I would appreciate the data. I don't need names or anything, but of how many students are still in Kansas that took advantage of this. So, and I would be more apt to be in favor to see that it was producing results for us here in Kansas. So I would like to request some of the data of the results.
Happy to provide.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Any more questions? All right. Vice President Frisbee, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate it. Okay, that will close our hearing, and we will go to Gabrielle and hear about service centers. Thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon, committee. Gabrielle Hull, Legislative Coordinator with KSDE. You should have a very short memo in front of you today from us, providing a little bit of background information on our education service centers. The statute cited in your memo, KSA 72-13100, does authorize boards of education to enter into interlocal cooperation agreements. The primary purpose of interlocal cooperative agreements is going to be to provide efficient and effective special education services. And there's two primary types of interlocal cooperation agreements that our districts are entering into. And confusingly, we call those cooperatives and interlocals. Cooperatives are set up that one district is going to be the fiscal agent, overseeing a lot of those administrative things for the member districts. And then interlocals will have a separate governing board that is created, and the interlocal itself would be the fiscal agent for those member districts. And in Kansas, we have 24 co-ops with 103 member districts within them, and 17 interlocals with 150 member districts. So the education service centers that we talk about are interlocals, and they provide more than special education services. Their additional services are going to range quite broadly and really can be any service that those member districts want to provide. So some of those could be budget assistance during the budget cycle. They can work with contracting staff. So if the member districts can't afford a specific position in each of their districts, there could be a contracted staff within a education service center that those districts can share. Some alternative schools are within education service centers, and then some of the service centers also facilitate pooled insurance groups. So your memo does have a list of our education service centers in Kansas. KSDE does often contract with our service centers to provide some professional development and training. And I will say, since KISA 2.0 has come into effect, we've done a lot more work collaborating with education service centers to make sure that all of the training and professional development is aligned to standards, and we've done a lot more work actually delivering professional development and training alongside our service centers. So that is a broad overview, and I will entertain any questions you might have on those.
Thank you. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for bringing this information today. Can you tell me which of the service centers have the TASN projects attached to them and receive their funding?
That would have been a good list to provide. I do not have our TASN list with me, but I am more than happy to get that for you.
I would like to have that. Thank you.
Representative Hill, and then McNorton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Gabrielle, thanks for being here. I have a lot of interest in federal funds and how they flowed through the department. We know that a lot of the special ed money goes to these interlocals and cooperatives / service centers. What other money is there? You talk about that many times the Department of Education contracts with service centers. I assume that shows up in the Department of Education budget figures. Is that correct?
Excuse me. I did not look into which contracts were paying service centers for, so I can certainly look into that. I will say most of our service centers have either or both a membership fee for school districts or a fee for service. So some of the special education services are going to be a fee for service model, so whichever services you need assistance with, there will be a fee for that. And then typically, I think Greenbush is the only one that doesn't have a membership fee for districts. I will check on our relationship with service centers and what those contracts look like, because KSDE typically provides training for free. So I'm not sure what, if any, financial agreement we have with the service centers.
If I may. What I'm really looking at more is not so much the memberships there, but the contracts that you, kind of walk me through a little bit. If the State Department gets a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to teach letters, I don't know, whatever, then you would contract as a department with a service center to provide that kind of training.
So specifically with letters, some of the service centers have had members of their staff trained, which we would have provided. I talked to Ben Proctor about this morning, actually, and we don't think it's very many that we actually paid to be trained at service centers, because so many of them were trained before KSDE entered into the contract with letters. So for letters, there would have been some staff members that took advantage of our ESSER funds to be trained in letters to be a trainer, but we do not have a contract with them in that sense for that service.
So what are these mini contracts that are mentioned here? What are those mini contracts? Not many, but many, lots.
Yeah, I'll have to look into what our financial contracts are, if any, because the KSDE relationship with a lot of external agencies, if we're providing professional development or training, that's usually free for KSDE to provide it. I did not bring any information on if we have financial contracts with the service centers that they're providing any training on our behalf. Their governing board is largely going to be in charge of their financial structure.
One last one, then I'll shut up. Okay. And then the other, if that's okay, do service centers enter into contracts with the U.S. Department of Education without going through the State Board of Education?
I would have to look into what their relationship is to federal funding. The interlocal is going to be the fiscal agent. So I think it's possible that interlocals and service centers could receive federal funds, but I unfortunately didn't bring that with me today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative McNorton, then Pishney and Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just, whatever the TASM, I'm lost on that abbreviation or acronym or whatever. What are we talking about? What? Okay. Thank you.
It's the Technical Assistance Support Network, so it provides some specific support to school districts in the state.
I'm not trying to be obnoxious about calling on people, but that you answered that without turning on your mic, and people can't hear, so let's be very careful about that, please. And so you explained what it is. Did you have follow-up? Would you like? I think that is an area that we would probably love to invite you guys back to educate us a little bit more on in the future. Thank you. Any other questions, Representative? All right, then I will move on to Representative Pishney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a point of information, I find this list interesting that you've provided, Gabrielle, because Greenbush, and it denotes Girard and Lawrence, and I know that's their location, but they are actually serving one of our early childhood providers, Russell Child Development Center in Garden City. So they're reaching out to other parts of the state, unlike the sublet group that's really focused on the southwest Kansas area. So I just, doesn't make a bit of difference in this discussion, but I just think it's interesting information. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point, because I probably did think of them as geographically bound in my own mind. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again for being here. I guess I have a question kind of like on Representative Hill. When the service center or the interlocal engages in a contract with TASN, does KSDE get involved with that contract?
I would have to look into what our TASN contract structure is. I didn't prepare for TASN today, but I would be more than happy to prepare for that later.
Thank you.
Do you have any additional questions for Gabrielle? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate this. I definitely feel like I have a better understanding of what they do and they don't do. This concludes everything that I had planned for today, but I always like to open it up for anything for the order of the good. Okay, seeing nothing that anybody would like to talk about, I will adjourn us at what may be tied for our shortest meeting ever. Thank you guys very much for good questions.